Very nice to meet you, sir. It's a pleasure to be able to contribute to your university's mission and on this particularly important topic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Alden. I want also to introduce you to Nicolás Fernández. He's the Vice Chancellor of Universidad Internacional del Ecuador, but I think that we have some issues with maybe with the video of Nicolás. So, Nicolás, ¿nos escuchas? I guess he has a kind of connection problem, but well, let's.
This is the world we live in. So.
Yes, maybe in some minutes. I think he is trying to reconnect.
Estamos listos, Michelle.
Perfecto.
Buenas tardes, Nati. Días, perdón, Nati. Solo esperar 2 segundos. No, algunos estudiantes están con problemas al ingresar porque les pide un ID.
¿Sabes qué? Me parece que ya está grabado ahí el ID. A mí no me lo solicitó, pero se les puede dar la contraseña que les acaba de dar César, ¿no? Que es UASB minúscula.
Perfecto, gracias.
César Mullo, ¿nos podría comentar cuántas personas ya están en la conferencia?
68 personas.
Ah, perfecto. Creo que ya es un público considerable. Esperemos que se sigan juntando.
Ya estamos con la transmisión por la página de CAEI también.
Perfecto.
Perfecto, muchas gracias. José, tú avísanos, tal vez conoces si es que Nicolás se está reconectando. Me parece que tuvo alguna dificultad de audio y de video.
Nati, tenemos, Nicolás todavía tuvo un problema con el Cisco Webex y se está reconectando. Estará en 2-3 minutos nosotros. No sé si creen pertinente mandar un mensaje a todos en lista de espera o en la sala de espera diciendo que vamos a esperar en unos 4 minutos tal vez.
Sí, Besan, yo puedo tipear ese mensaje, sí, para todos los asistentes.
Mejor.
Sí, en este momento ya nos están escuchando también. Entonces, si pudieron escuchar los asistentes del mensaje que nos dijeron.
Ah, perfecto. Entonces, so welcome to this event. We ask you to have a little bit of patience because we are just ultimating some details. So we are going to start in the following minutes, please. César Muyo, si podría por favor aceptarle a Nicolás Fernández, que se encuentra en la sala de espera.
Listo.
El audio, ahí me escuchan.
Sí, Nicolás,
Ah, ya,
bienvenido, buen día.
finalmente.
Te escuchamos,
Con
no te
todos.
vemos, ahí te vemos, perfecto.
Ya.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, creo que podemos empezar, ¿no? ¿Qué les parece? Ujú. Michelle, ¿qué te parece? ¿Damos inicio al evento?
Listo. Nos indica que
Ujú. César, ¿nos comentaba algo?
sí, que por mi parte también estamos listos.
Perfecto. Bueno, entonces voy a dar inicio. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this event co-organized by Universidad Internacional del Ecuador and its School of International Relations, along with Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar, sede Ecuador, and its Andean Center for International Studies, as a project of the Group of Foreign Policy Analysis of Ecuador. I am Natalia Encalada, lecturer at Universidad Internacional del Ecuador, and today I am honored to moderate this conference, and we are very fortunate to have as our keynote speaker, Professor Christopher Alden, expert in foreign policy analysis from London School of Economics. To start this event, let me introduce first Dr. César Montaño Galarza, Rector of Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar, sede Ecuador, who will welcome our Spanish-speaking audience.
Muy buenos días. ¿Me escuchan?
Yes, yes.
Un gusto saludarles, un gusto Natalia, gracias por esa apertura. Un saludo muy cordial a Nicolás Fernández, canciller de la Universidad Internacional del Ecuador. Un saludo muy especial a Michelle Levy, coordinador del Centro Andino de Estudios Internacionales de la Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar. Y un saludo especial también al profesor Christopher Alden por haber hecho un espacio en su importante agenda como especialista en relaciones internacionales, en política exterior, muy reconocido con una larga trayectoria, para poder acompañarnos acá en este evento tan importante y poder compartir con él mucho de su conocimiento. Quiero decirles que este evento se da gracias a ese ámbito de cooperación que hemos podido impulsar, que hemos podido pensar en conjunto con la Universidad Internacional del Ecuador. Gustavo Vega, su rector, ha tenido siempre pues toda la apertura para que trabajemos conjuntamente, dos instituciones universitarias cercanas, unidas en la perspectiva de proveer las condiciones necesarias para que podamos pensar con un efecto más elevado, con alto nivel, la problemática de las relaciones exteriores, la problemática internacional en general. Se han vinculado para esto la Escuela de Estudios Internacionales de la UIDE y el Centro Andino de Estudios Internacionales, Centro Andino de Estudios Internacionales de la Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar, sede Ecuador. A la final, el propósito central de esta conferencia y de este grupo de trabajo y de análisis sobre política exterior busca no solamente compartir de manera experta elementos centrales que hacen a las relaciones internacionales y a la política exterior, es decir, llevar a un debate elevado estas problemáticas que conciernen a nuestros países, a los países del sur sobre todo, respecto al resto del mundo. Por otro lado, generar las condiciones para proyectos de investigación que nos puedan potenciar con una voz autorizada desde universidades ecuatorianas para el resto del mundo. Y en tercer lugar, poder proveer no solamente a la sociedad, sino a los tomadores de decisión pública, a quienes diseñan las políticas en materia internacional, en política exterior concretamente, poderles proveer una serie de elementos que nos sitúen de manera realista en la perspectiva del relacionamiento con el resto de países del planeta. Así que para mí ha sido realmente un gusto poder estar aquí con ustedes, darles la bienvenida, agradecer ese esfuerzo conjunto de los departamentos de la Universidad Internacional del Ecuador y de la Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar, sede Ecuador, y particularmente a sus autoridades, en el caso de la UID, y al profesor Christopher Alden, nuevamente nuestro agradecimiento muy sentido. Esperamos que esta sea solamente una de las primeras actividades que podamos hacer conjuntamente, de tal manera que podamos seguir contribuyendo a nuestro país. Muchísimas gracias y muchos éxitos en este importante evento.
Thanks to Dr. Montaño. And now let me also introduce Dr. Nicolás Fernández, Vice Chancellor of Universidad Internacional del Ecuador.
Thank you, Natalia. I'm very pleased to inaugurate this co-hosted event, and special greetings to President Cesar Montaño from Universidad Andina, our co-host in this event. And I also want to thank our partners at LSE for making this possible, especially Professor Alden for spending some time with us today. It does please me to host this webinar in collaboration, especially because, interesting fact, majority of our international relations faculty is actually UK educated, and 3 of our faculty are current LSE alums. One of them is Natalia Encalada, Nadia Atala, and Daniela Garces, all present in this webinar. So we really pride ourselves to have one of the most international faculty of any international relations schools in Ecuador. And pleases me to see some growing ties with LSE, and I hope there's some further room for collaboration. I'm myself a product of UK education. I graduated from London Business School, and I hate admitting it, but LSE really does have a better brand recognition in this part of the world, because not only once have I been wrongly introduced as an LSE alum. And so, yeah, anyways, today's topic is certainly fascinating and very relevant in this changing times. Economic growth has stagnated in many of the developing nations and slowed down dramatically in Asian tiger economies as well. So it's really the last frontier, the global south, that can provide some growth in our world, and that is Latin America, Africa, and some Southeast Asian countries. But then COVID came and has put the world upside down, as we know, and we have to ask ourselves how is it impacting globalization. It has exposed the system that is certainly vulnerable, with long extended supply chains, and all of a sudden, beginning of the pandemic, some very basic goods became scarce in the most developed economies. And so it will be interesting to see how that will play out in terms of globalization. And then we have this threat of looming nationalism that we're seeing in South America, in Brazil, and in the United States, and some European countries. And the topic of access to news and information, like we never had it, but it also comes with the threat of misinformation, fake news, and our region is especially vulnerable to such threats. We have a history of falling for populism and a very unequally educated population. So within all that context, it's just a very interesting question to ask: how should Ecuador, a small, relatively unimportant country on the grand scale, define its foreign policy? And it's a very difficult question to answer, and it will take talented and skilled people like our and Andina's students to provide an answer in the future for that country. So again, I want to thank Professor Alden for spending some time with us today, and everyone present. And I'm really curious to listen to this, and hopefully more webinars to come in collaboration with LSE. Thank you.
Thanks for your words, Dr. Fernandez. And now I'm privileged to introduce Professor Christopher Alden. He has a PhD in Law and Diplomacy from Tufts University. He is currently professor in the Department of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and associate researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs. He was co-founder and director of the Global South Unit Research Center at LSE, and he is currently co-director of the LSE IDEAS think tank. His research has focused on the international politics of the Global South, China and Africa, post-conflict reconstruction, as well as the influence of China in Latin America. Today, Professor Alden will share with us his ideas on the importance of understanding agency for the Global South in a changing international system in terms of balancing, brokering, and imbibing. So thanks a lot, Professor Alden, for your willingness to participate in this initiative, which aims to foster FPA research in Ecuador and Latin America, and thanks to all the colleagues that have been involved in the organization of this event. So during the lecture, we will be receiving questions of the audience through the chat. So remember to include your name and institution, and we will have a dialogue based on your questions at the end of the lecture. So welcome again, Professor Alden, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, just to be confirmed? That is now the traditional greeting of anyone makes on Zoom or WebEx or what have you, is can you hear me? And I'm starting with that traditional greeting. Thank you to everyone for first to Natalia and colleagues, the Vice Chancellor, Dr. Fernandez, and of course the President Montaño, for your words at the beginning and for your help and assistance in allowing this event to go forward. I would like to speak today. I'm going to share with you my PowerPoint, which will give us a sort of map of what it is we'll be doing. So if you'll just bear with me a moment. It should be on your screen. Can you see it? Yes, okay. Good. What I wanted to talk to you today about was this concept of agency. And agency is something that has gathered attention in the work of scholarship on the Global South. I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of this idea, but I'm also going to contextualize it because there's a whole history. I would say that the work that we see on autonomy in foreign policy, which is probably familiar to people in Latin America, especially, it's on a spectrum of being linked with that, and so I'm going to contextualize that as well. I then would like to bring in FPA, foreign policy analysis, and in particular the place of role theory as a source or an explanation for a contributing explanation for how we could understand agency, and agency specifically in the Global South. So let me start with a kind of summary of how of what I'm going to talk about, which is a look at agency, international relations as a discipline in the Global South. My second section will focus on foreign policy of agency in the Global South, balancing, brokering, imbibing, and beyond that, actually. Then I'd like to look at foreign policy, role theory, and agency. So that third section, and then finally some concluding remarks. So as I said, agency is something that a term that has come to be associated with countries in asymmetrical power relationships. Relationships with weaker countries, smaller countries, and relationships with larger states, or larger organizations. This discourse on agency has its roots back in an earlier scholarship, and I want to point us found in international relations, and I would like to point us in that direction first before we unpack the ideas of agency, because they've been very influential. Initially, when one talked about the Global South, most of the work, overwhelming amount of work on Global South and the question of foreign policy was embedded within what we would call structural accounts of international politics. That is to say, overarching accounts of the relationship between systems, power, and the units within it, the states principally within it. So we had the proliferation of a number of theories, world systems theory, crude Marxism, and other sorts of theories that posited or that presented the idea that the way we understand foreign policy of states is it's really a subset of a larger relationship, a systemic-driven relationship where power asymmetry guides things. So there's a bias in this work towards status accounts There's also a simplistic reading of asymmetrical power relations. What do I mean? It's that essentially, if by a number of metrics, if you're seen to have significant power resources, those are translatable to positive foreign policy outcomes for the stronger state, entity, hegemon, what have you, vis-a-vis states in other regions, the historically disadvantaged, the global south as we talk about it today. There were other readings, sociological ones that were somewhat more nuanced, that talked about societal elements, power elites, transnational capitalist class, the neo-Gramscians. They also looked at the possibility of state action, right? But saw in it limitations, structural limitations, which meant ultimately that the idea of foreign policy and the study of foreign policy in the global south was marginalized. It was reduced, it was seen to be reductionist, even deterministic, that structural relationship. So scholarship tended to not focus on foreign policy questions and certainly didn't believe there was much choice available to governments and societies in the global south. So as I said, this resulted in an academic study that did not provide much focus on foreign policy making. IR scholars assigned to countries relationships that were rooted in the power structures. So we talk about regional subordinates in the Middle East or middle powers and possibly even emerging powers, but again, they're framed within regional contexts. So India, Brazil, South Africa are seen to be part of the hub and spoke arrangements. At least that's how some scholarship had characterized it. Some parts of the world were scripted out altogether. Africa is marginalized. The number of works pointed to this. The popular literature also pointed to this. The idea that it was such an anomaly that it didn't fit into the international system, that it might even prove to be a challenge to international relations theory at large. Famously or infamously, Hazelton said in the mid-'80s that Latin America has foreign relations but no foreign policy. So sort of taking away the agency, the possibility of agency for actors within the global south, within Latin America in this case, within Africa, within parts of Asia, etc. So from this perspective, foreign policy choices are predetermined at best, might not even be choices. These are sort of derivative of or a function of top-down power relationships, vertical power relationships. There is a literature, as you'll be familiar with, those of you in development study, dependencia, which I flag here because it does confer a measure of agency. There's some contingency for state capacity. But what's interesting about that, and I want to come back to this, is those who in that tradition who do Prebisch and the like do talk about the possibilities there, link of some capacity, link it to things like collective action and working through institutions that are framed by ideology, international institutions framed by ideologies, shared ideologies. So that I think is an important caveat to my comment about the absence of foreign policy choices. Global South scholarship focuses, as a consequence of that, where we see Global South or scholarship on FPA, on foreign policy analysis, where we see the focus has been primarily on degrees of foreign policy autonomy, as I said a moment ago, somewhere between autonomy and agency, and how to operate or function as a country within the constraints, the structural constraints. The language one used was neorealist. That is to say, it's a language of hedging, balancing, that sort of thing. Defensive, offensive, balancing, and the like. And those of you in IR will be familiar with. Globalization led by the United States was said to limit, or I would argue that globalization, in fact, introduced further constraints to that. And I would say it's more useful to look at global South foreign policy as one of three things: either acting as a balancing mechanism or operating, foreign policy operating in balancing terms, serving as brokers between different regions and or different groupings, or if you like, imbibing, that is to say, embracing the dominant perspectives and incorporating that foreign policy set of objectives, internalizing those and taking them as one's own. Okay, so balancing, let's look at that and how foreign policy of the Global South reflects balancing activity. That's foreign policy of balancing is based fundamentally on collective action. The expectation here is that through collective action, states, a foreign policy oriented towards collective action, states can pull together the resources they have in principally, not exclusively, in multilateral institutions. They can use this to mobilize resources to achieve collective aims. So the primary dilemma of foreign policy from this perspective is how to sustain collective action, right, against all the pressures, the push and pull pressures that function within a collective action scenario. So foreign policy of collective action is the glue of that becomes the construction of regional identities. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, SADC, the Southern African Development Community, the Pacific Alliance, you name it. There's a whole, any one of these has some kind of framing device, generally geographic, but not exclusively. We have the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, right, which is identity-based in a different way. And they produce solidarity discourses that become the kind of moral language around which they function. Okay, so balancing in the Global South produces a foreign policy, is derivative of and produces a foreign policy of collective action built on regional identities that utilizes solidarity discourses as a way of holding the glue together of this. Identity is the primary challenge, as I mentioned a moment ago, is taking this established set of normative set of discourses and institutions and frameworks, and using these to penetrate and communicate and indeed succeed in projecting one's foreign policy aims on a global stage, principally through multilateral institutions. So we have lots of theories of this. The one that I believe will be most familiar to you is the relative autonomy concepts of Russell and Tocqueville. They talk about and they employ the language of neo-realism, but modify it to the context of Latin America and the US. And they talk about strategy options here. And it's interesting because they're writing in a post-Cold War environment, or at least they initially conceived of their work in that period. They dispense with a number of instruments available to Latin America's states in the past. Extra hemispheric protection, right? USSR, Cuba is the most obvious one. Nicaragua during a certain period as well. So this sort of thing. Collective unity, social revolution, and third worldism. These are all seen as museum pieces. What I would argue is that they are now, some of those elements are being reformulated and restored as we move from a unipolar post-Cold War environment to one of multipolarity. So that diversity of choices is widening. It isn't just about intra-Latin American collective action, but rather joining up with the possibility of joining up with our outsiders as well. External forces as well. As I mentioned, there are other examples of collective action. ASEAN is very interesting in the way that it handles the solidarity question. I think that they probably are the most successful in terms of managing external relations and producing a collective foreign policy. The EU is also has similar successes, which is to talk about dialogue partners. They actually formalize and construct relationships through a set of institutionalized forms, the dialogue partnership, around given issues and or relationships, and that enables them to I think manage the collective dimension a little more closely than they would if they were doing it on a more ad hoc basis. Okay. The next area of global South foreign policy that we see emerging out of the autonomy, the drive for autonomy and explanations that are autonomy seeking is that of what I'm calling brokers. It's the foreign policy of middle powers. These are powers which are in the global South. They achieve a certain distinction in terms of material resources available to them, their capacity, their regional reach, sometimes their global reach, selectively so. Cooper, Nozzle, and others who write on this subject talk about niche diplomacy. So you have countries like Singapore able to project very far into regions or areas using relatively modest resources, but pinpointing them to selectively join, for instance, multilateral groups that focus on particular issues of concern, etc. So middle powers produce brokering roles. They are mediators. They mediate issues between different parties or groupings, generally state systems. Again, they're system stabilizers in that respect. Okay? They actually actively seek to enhance the capacity of multilateralism and to stabilize the system such that it would be more prone towards stability rather than conflict. If you think of Costa Rica's investment in the 1980s into diplomacy, mediation and diplomacy towards Central American states, that's perhaps an example of a system mediator that seeks to stabilize. And then they're all active multilateralists. They think multilateral institutions, by definition, that the foreign policy of multilateral institutions, or rather their foreign policy oriented towards multilateral institutions, provides a way of amplifying, of projecting their own foreign policy aims onto the global stage. And through the institutions of the normative frameworks of multilateralism, they're able to achieve form collectively, and through these institutions and through their power resources, they're able to achieve foreign policy gains. But they're always working in conjunction with the great powers, right? They're seen to be doing that. Okay, so sufficient resources and some capacity to exercise a measure of foreign policy autonomy. Perhaps a good example is Malaysia's foreign policy under Mahathir. Here, he took a middle-income country, a dynamic one in the 1980s and 90s, and turned it into an activist in the region, in ASEAN, brokering the relationship with Myanmar, which was not a member at the time, and the European Union, the United States, and others that were pressuring Myanmar and ASEAN on that question. We see activism in terms of reaching out to the global South more generally. Mahathir plays a crucial, if somewhat forgotten, role in helping to elevate, in the post-Cold War era, the idea of the global South. He starts in the late 80s, working with the non-aligned movement, the South Commission. He helps underwrite that. He sets up the G15 as a counterbalance to the G7 of the day. So they're the foreign policy of middle power, it's activist, and then through identity markers that are significant domestically, Islam and the IOC, as I mentioned, Malaysia's work trying to mediate in the Balkans at the time. We have other global South countries that have been designated as middle powers, which by the 2000s had begun to be recharacterized because of their economic weight as emerging powers, India and Brazil amongst them. And then the third in the era of globalization, the third approach to global South foreign policy has been what I've called imbibing. Probably that term is why I wanted to drink a moment ago. But anyway, these are states that conduct policies, institutional and have institutional features and ideational features which represent or cloy to the dominant hegemon of the day, okay, the United States in this particular post-Cold War context. They reframe state-society relationships domestically in ways that reflect those ideas and pursue foreign policy alignments that promote or align as well with that. So South Africa in the earliest phase, in the Mandela and Mbeki phase, very much represented that, embracing neoliberalism both in domestic policies and foreign policies, goes so far as to construct a regional project or lead a regional project which promotes variations of neoliberal ideas. NEPAD, the new economic program for African development and the African Renaissance, aimed at restructuring the African region aligned with market-friendly approaches, liberal democracy, and all those sorts of things. So those are the three basic foreign policy responses you can see in the Global South. Again, some of them are replicate the work on foreign policy of autonomy or other work that is out there, but I think it's useful to sort of bunch them together in the three. I still think it's inadequate. I think that there are a couple of problems here, and this is where I wear my FPA hat in particular. One of them is this approach, this sort of analysis assumes basically a unitary picture of the state. It doesn't problematize the state. It doesn't tell us how foreign policy is made. It just describes the outcomes of foreign policy. It doesn't give you insight into the forces, be they societal forces, be they represented as interest groups, represented as political parties, represented as any of those of bureaucratic interest, institutional, business, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't have that richness. And it seems to me that any scholar of FPA would recognize that you can't tell the story of international politics, much less the story of foreign policy of a given country or region, without access to that. Okay? So foreign policy decision-making as a function or a feature of this process needs to be opened up. We need to look at the state. We need to understand individual preferences of leaders. We need to understand bureaucratic politics. As I mentioned again, the groups, interest groups, the selectorate in authoritarian states, media, public opinion, they all exercise in different ways and in different state-society relationships influences over policy formation. So accounting for that is important in describing how we got to the foreign policy choices we did. And then finally, I would say that there's underlying this, and this is what leads me to the agency question, is a flawed understanding of relational dynamics as shaped by ideational factors. What do I mean by that? I think that there's a role for ideas here, right? And ideas are part of the currency. It's not just material currency that goes between states. They also, the currency of ideas, the currency of solidarity, of shared values. These are things that are important, creating alignments and alliances. These ideas, which eventually are given material content, right, in terms of commercial exchange or security arrangements or what have you, but the role of ideas is crucial, and I think that where those ideas fit into the individual leaders' outlook, into the political parties that are operational in the state, the societal forces at large also need to be accounted, and how those ideas become part of the bargaining between states that are weaker and states that are stronger. That, in essence, I think is part of the agency question, right? Agency is the capacity of weaker states in asymmetrical power relationships to be able to mobilize resources in order to secure preferential outcomes in foreign policy. Okay, so they're weaker states able to mobilize resources in order to achieve preferential outcomes in which accord with their foreign policy aims. This is ideas are as significant as and a feature of interest as are material factors. Let me go into why I say that. Okay, so foreign policy analysis comes in. Enter foreign policy analysis at this stage, foreign policy analysis and role theory in particular. What foreign policy, or rather, let me say a little bit more about agency, and then I'll come to the role theory dimension of this. A lot of the work on agency that looked at weak states were produced by scholars of the most marginalized regions in the world, in particular Africa. And the basic question that Brown and Harman asked was how do relatively weak African governments secure favorable outcomes in negotiations with more powerful external actors, some of them states, sometimes multilateral institutions? What are the circumstances that produce this? What are the conditions that produce this? And so the focus was on multilateral organizations, emerging powers, and African states. The studies that we've seen on that were focused on China and Africa in particular. I'm working with a Turkish colleague on the role of Turkey in Africa, which has been interesting as a kind of alternative explanation. I've done work with colleagues on Brazil and Brazil's role in Africa as well. So some of these things draw from that. Some of the comments I'm making draw from that particular background and research and literatures. I think the key here to understanding to breaking down or going below the surface of just the state to open what we call opening the black box of decision making and saying what goes on inside the decision making process. One of the keys is to understand these agency-based negotiations in two ways. One of them is to look at them is a set of negotiations where agency is framed, the negotiations themselves are framed in commercial terms. Okay, the discussions between the stronger state and the weaker state are framed in terms of material gains, transactional material exchanges, to which they bargain oil, access for oil in exchange for some sort of financial resources or some material contribution to development or what have you. So it's a commercial relationship. Another set of relations which run in parallel, it's not exclusively ideational, but it is an expansion of this commercial relationship, is an ideational framing of the relationship. What this does is framing of the relation in terms of shared values and solidarity. And what we've seen in the research that I and others have done is this has enhanced opportunities for negotiation and preferred outcomes. It doesn't guarantee preferred outcomes, but it broadens the framework of what can be negotiated. Okay, the examples that come to mind in particular are in terms of Turkey and its approach. Erdogan, the leader of the former prime minister, now president, has sought to frame his relationship with countries in the Middle East, with countries in North Africa and countries in sub-Saharan Africa in language which often plays exactly to the fraternal relationship, shared history, common history, and a common bond in Islam, right? African states which partake in negotiations that are framed not just in commercial terms. This is, of course, instrumentalized by Turkey to gain access to certain contracts or to gain access to certain foreign policy outcomes that they would prefer. But African governments that recognize this have been able to use this ideational framing to push back, to gain more on the negotiating front than they might have when just working on commercial terms. So I'm not going to go into too much more detail on this. I know time is running short, but my key point to take away, because I think this is a generalizable point, which is to say that agency, that there are commercial agency appears in different dimensions or to different degrees, depending on how you frame relationships. Your asymmetrical relationship, and those ones which are narrowly defined in commercial material terms tend to the weaknesses of the smaller state of the global South are more exposed, if you like. They have less room for maneuverability and gaining preferential outcomes. Ideational ones expand that. It may not expand it much. It may not change the fundamentals, but it does provide another avenue, another outlet for bargaining within that relationship. Okay, let me talk about role theory here, because I think that what the theory of agency doesn't do, and what is it doesn't draw sufficiently on established FPA work. Established FPA work, in particular in role theory, because I think it helps us to understand why, the why question. Why is it that states are able to exploit, weaker states are able to exploit opportunities when it comes to ideational framing of relationships, right, between strong and with stronger states? And I think that this that role theory provides an answer in the following way. Role theory tells us that states identify their position and status and standing on the international stage. They tell a story about themselves. Are they a stabilizer? Are they a protector? Are they a revolutionary? Their relationship to the international system is framed by a set of roles and of different ideas of roles. Okay. Cameron Tias, amongst others, but Holstein and Walker talk about this. These roles are the point of departure for how they engage with other states, the international community at large. Sometimes they're in contradiction. Sometimes the self-appointed role is in opposition to the conduct of a particular foreign policy action. You can be, for instance, a very classic one is being pro-democratic in rhetoric, but in actions being quite having a negative impact, pursuing policies which have a negative impact on democracy. So these sort of the gap between these expectations, how one frames oneself and how they are, and how others experience that foreign policy of a larger power, become an opportunity for weaker states, for states in the global South to say, to use that ideational framing of the relationship, of the role, and say, look, you're not living up to it. Look, you're not providing you said this was a mutual, what is the term, a win-win situation. I'm not sure it's a win-win situation. That framing of it doesn't accord with the experiences we have. So these ideational framings become tools, instruments in the hands of activist states within the global South to be able to at least tilt the table a bit more in their direction to gain concessions on other sides. Role theory focuses also on gaps within states, between leaders and societies, their own expectations of foreign policy, who they are on the global stage, and what the foreign policy is, which foreign policy they pursue. Also intra-institutional expectations. Sometimes leaders, I think that if you were to look right now at the United States, the gap between the institutional figures in the State Department and the administration is one representation of the different roles, different role expectations clashing. So what role theory does for us is it enables us to understand the conditions in which a foreign policy agency can operate and how it does function. You need enabling conditions. So role theory, I think, is the glue, if you like, that can help explain, give us a better, more social scientifically rooted explanation than agency alone does. Role theory provides that. I know time is escaping very quickly, so I'm just going to rattle off a few final comments and then open it up for questions. So what explains where we see positive outcomes in the empirical work? What explains it? One is reputational position. Weak states can exploit role-based foreign policies, and which are in conflict, which are the gap between the stated role, the stated public expectation, and the outcomes. Ideational commercial exchanges. Sometimes the nature of exchange is what we need to look at. Weak states sometimes are able to trade ideas of solidarity, for instance, alignment, what have you, in exchange for material gains. So they tilt the table to gain material things by using what's available to them in ideation or alignment of foreign policy. And then finally, a third comment perhaps is that perhaps these foreign policy gains that we are noting are a function of the temporal conditions we're in right now, the transitional policies of a system that's in flux, that the international system opens up more opportunities as we move from unipolarity to multipolar system, but that once that is more fixed, that those opportunities may fade away, and that this is a given moment. It's not an eternal condition, as it were, but rather an opportunity for agency that will not be return for some time once the hard and fast politics of the international system solidify. My last comments are just to say that for FPA and role theory in particular is a starting point for explaining foreign policy agency. Role theory is seen by FPA proponents as a bridge between international relations, the subject and domain of international relations, and foreign policy analysis. And I think this is yet another example of how it can serve or function as a bridge across the two disciplines and reunite international relations and foreign policy. And then my very last point is to say that we still have a big job ahead of us, however. When we talk about foreign policy of the Global South, we use conceptual terms which are really rooted in US and European experience. And I think that the question of generalizability is one we have to face. And I would urge you to look at some of the work of FPA scholars. I've listed them at the bottom on India, of South Africa, China, but there are others as well who try to translate the conceptual terms of FPA, bureaucratic politics and others, and understand those and how they function in the context of the countries of the Global South and the dynamics of state-society relations there. So there's much more to say, but I will stop. All good academics have to be cut off. They never quite finish what they say. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Alden, for this lecture. A lot of very interesting points to analyze. We have some questions, but first of all, I would like to ask the other panelists if they have any questions to pose. Okay, so while maybe if you the panelists want to add any comment, in the meanwhile, I am going to pass you the question of Aaron Rodriguez, a student of the International Relations School of Universidad Internacional del Ecuador. He says that he wonders if a reform in the Security Council of the UN that could accept middle powers like India or Brazil as permanent members change the course of the foreign policy of the Global South in making it more proactive or getting advantage more of this agency. What do you think about this, Professor Alden?
I think it's vital to have voices from the Global South in the upper echelon of key multilateral institutions. It's also, I mean, the problem of getting those voices up there is not just one of Security Council of established members, and that's how it's often portrayed. I think the disputes within the Global South have also been problematic. If you look at the last big push, 2004, when Kofi Annan that was what he had hoped to be one of his signature achievements as Secretary General, was to be able to reorganize the Security Council, which, by the way, it's been reorganized before from 9 to 15 on the non-permanent member basis. And that was tough. That was done in a Cold War setting. But what made it difficult was there wasn't consensus on this regional distribution. The G4 countries, Japan, India, Brazil, South Africa that's right, or India, Brazil, South Africa, and Japan were working together as to try to secure seats on that basis. And that was there were other states within the Global South, as well as China, that found different reasons why that was problematic. The African states proposed something that was a rotating seat, which was seen to be unacceptable, though a compromise and acceptable within African context. So you can see that the lack of a coherent position is as much a problem as any resistance from Security Council members. And I always find it confusing that this sort of consensus can't be put together so that we can move forward on what has to be a fundamental issue collectively for countries of the Global South.
Thank you, Professor Alden. In the same field of the politics, as you have said, of the multilateral institutions, this is a personal question that I would like to add. In the last few months or last few years, we have listened to those ideas of having a world parliament, which would replace in a certain way the UN and have a little bit more supranational powers. So what do you think about thinking of a new multilateral and supranational, we would say, form of government maybe, in order to give this kind of more agency for the new powers, for the middle powers, even for the small countries, in order to have a little bit more agency in the international topics?
I think that I think that there's historical precedent for this, but I think we have to view it with caution because again, we might have the most representative institution, but it's in danger of, if it turns its back on power relationships, it then becomes a sort of toothless organization, a talking shop, which is of course the usual criticism that one puts towards these very large multilateral bodies. I think that I like the idea of World Social Forum and those sorts of alternatives. My talk today has been overly representative of statist perspectives. Foreign policy is a state-produced activity, but I don't think that the best foreign policies are divorced from social forces. The best ones recognize social forces, integrate those forces, have a dialogue, and that dialogue can be formalized, institutionalized, or otherwise. And I think that goes for the global stage as well. What worries me about the large movements, I think they're very good for kickstarting and putting issues on the agenda, but do they have the effective teeth, as it were, to actually produce outcomes? We have you may, from your history, remember that just before World War II broke out, a few years before, countries came together and decided to outlaw war. There was that they committed themselves to no provisions for that, right? The Kellogg-Briand Pact. It didn't work. So I think we need to find ways that have where all the stakeholders are involved. You expand it, maybe take the existing mechanism of the United Nations and amend it. It has evolved a little bit. I said the Security Council. It's been painful. It's never as fast or as far as we want. But sometimes scrubbing it all clean and throwing it away doesn't necessarily produce a better outcome.
That's the challenge, a big challenge for the world. And as you have said, Professor Alden, the UN needs also to reformulate some things. Maybe is a framework that it could still be useful for the world, but it has to continue evolving in terms of the dynamics of the international system. I want to pose you another question from Esteban Donoso. He says that there is a proposal stated first at a publication of the Universidad Andina to change the TRIPS agreement of the WTO in regards to patents. And he says that considering the context of poor countries, they are proposing not to have 20 years of this patent right in all countries, but a number of years determined by the economic capacity of each country. Because we know that in poor countries, there are a kind of bigger challenges in terms of accomplishing this commercial normative. So what do you think about this, Professor Alden, about this proposal?
Is the question whether it's a good thing for developing countries or the global south to have a variable, some changes to patent law to enable different, that takes into account development status? Is that how I understand the question?
Yes, I guess because it seems that it has been an Ecuadorian proposal, of course, in order to have benefits for the Ecuadorian industry and to maybe to include more the developing countries' context in these multilateral normatives, which sometimes are very difficult to accomplish by the global south, or especially the smaller countries.
I think that that this is an important initiative, and these sorts of things which account for variable development standing and status have to be recognized. There has to be a mechanism for recognizing the vulnerability of relatively, it isn't a matter of size actually, but it's new institutions, new initiatives, new business initiatives, which might themselves be snuffed out by the larger capital power and power of other multinationals or what have you. So I think that some accounting for that is possible. There is variation if you dig into international intellectual property laws. These are rules we make. These are rules we can change, and we can make opt-out clauses as suits. I suppose this is yet again a collective action problem. Are there can countries like Ecuador win enough support for initiatives such as this to be able to make it an item on the agenda that has to be addressed? Is it, rather than just a single initiative? So it has to be, for it to be successful, you need the weight of the global, a larger collectivity of states that will support it, and possibly firms as well. I think firms business voices would be interesting in this case.
Thank you, Professor Alden. Another question from Ana Maria Palacio from the University of Melbourne. She says that she would like you to provide us some more insights on how role theory and FPA could enhance our understanding of the agency of subnational governments.
That's interesting. I think that's at first, subnational governments are, by that I presume you mean provinces or states within substates, as it were. it's a very interesting and very under-researched topic. I mean, one way to, and they're not universal in character. I mean, Chinese provinces, for instance, or municipalities act on foreign economic basis in particular, as signatories and initiators or implementing agents across the world. In Canada, Quebec has special status and standing as a foreign policy actor, and we have others. They're not just commercial. I think that what role theory does, and I think I intimated that by a moment ago by using two different cases, Quebec and let's say Guangdong province, that there are regional differences which are recognizable. French-speaking in Quebec, for instance, that are rooted into the structural distinctions of why the province exists, what the language questions, and all those sorts of things. So those sorts of distinctions are the identity glue that help frame the types of initiatives that these particular subnational governments or entities pursue, right? So they, so the Quebecois, or rather the Quebec, are very much reaching out, playing the francophone card as a way for giving expression to their foreign policy commercial interests in parts of the francophone speaking world. The Portuguese are interesting. They have an international parliament. They have representation of Portuguese communities in in almost every country that there is a significant Portuguese community. Venezuela is one of them. South Africa is another. And they all sit in the parliament back in Lisbon, right, and have certain statutory rights. So, the different states' relationships there. Role theory helps us to understand the identity basis and conceptualization of what it is that's distinctive about that subnational government, and gives us an insight into how they exercise agency, is how they exercise that identity and seek to instrumentalize it to make commercial gains, entries into diplomatic or quasi-diplomatic arrangements, business, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not exactly the same, but it has echoes of how role theory relates to agency when it comes to national governments.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Professor Alden. Just to add to that question posed before, I have personally also researched a lot on role theory, and I would like to ask you, because you said that role theory gives us insights just as a start to understand foreign policy. So what do you think, what is missing yet, or what should be more developed in role theory in order to really cope with the challenges of understanding the agency and the dynamics of the Global South?
I think that role theory is unconsciously situated in an understanding of global politics, which is northern-based. Let's put it that way. I think that the developing context, that context of societies in transition, commercial forces, societies that are moving from rural areas to urban areas, those dynamics, weak institutions or overly strong institutions, all of that kind of stuff, it plays out in the North, but it's not as strongly felt. It's perhaps 2 generations ago or something like that. And I think that the result of that is that the idea of roles being in flux, roles as being changing, is not as well captured, and the range of roles that are available to the Global South, they're always played out in relationship to the power structures of the international system. Whereas I think, at least in the United States and Europe, parts of Europe, they will think, scholars there will think of role theory, that adopting roles is like, they think of it at a remove. They don't recognize the structural position that their own states are in when they're describing them, that amplify automatically the foreign policies that they choose. It's much harder to be heard, I think, if you're in the global south. You can't just willy-nilly, as it were, adopt new roles. You are really constrained in all sorts of ways that are not recognized by the literature, the conceptual approach to role theory, at least the earliest work. I like Cameron Tias's work because he begins to open up that box a little bit.
Yes, in fact, I follow Cameron Tias because he has written a lot about Latin America, and I agree with you, Professor Alden. Role theory really needs to pass that wall of the North-South relations and look more to the different dynamics of the different regions, because as you have said, it's not the same. Even in history, we have different developments, and in fact, all those concepts of role theory could be more, we would say, more deeper analyzed in terms of the different dynamics, as you have mentioned, shared values, ideational, ethnical issues in terms of what is happening in the global south, which is very different from the history and developments in the north part of the world, we would say. Okay, so let's pass to another question from Fernando Oña, a student at Universidad Internacional del Ecuador. He says, why the regional integration in Latin America is so difficult? Perhaps the culture is not so common, or the ideology of the political and economic systems of the country is very unstable. What do you think role theory could help in order to understand and improve the agency of different countries in terms of the regional bloc agency of Latin America?
Well, first, I'm not, unlike yourself, Natalia, or others, I'm not a Latin Americanist, so I can say some things about it, but I'd be cautious about what I say in that respect. My impression is that that if I do comparative work, if I think about ASEAN as a region of Southeast Asian nations, trying to come to create regional cohesion, regional organization, and I compare it to their equivalents, different equivalents, Mercosur or what have you, in Pacific Alliance and the like in Latin America, it's two odd things strike me. One is that many of the things that the Southeast Asians wish they had in their region, Latin America already has. Long, extended periods of relative peace, right? Nation states that are not at each other's throats to the same extent. There are obviously disputes and very strongly felt ones, right? Southeast Asia has over the same period of ASEAN has been invaded, occupied, has had serious conflict, genocide, what have you. They have a stronger institutional arrangement for cooperation, but they have very narrow ambitions. And so they are successful because I think the boundaries are very narrowly defined. And they've been gradualist. I think from what I can see, and again, I stand to be corrected because I don't know it well enough. The Latin American actions, they have very, very high ambitions, but they've already achieved some remarkable things outside of the framework of these cooperative organizations. So I think that paradox is actually the next stage. The successes that Southeast Asia wishes it would have are things that Latin America already starts with. So the agenda is perhaps therefore more ambitious. I mean, the European Union has achieved economic integration to an unprecedented degree, as we all know, and labor movement also. And in fact, they're now getting a backlash, right? And that backlash is represented in the country that I'm in, of course, Britain, withdrawing from the European Union. So I think that the ambitions become higher and higher. They scale up once you achieve certain successes, and perhaps the answer is that Latin America has already achieved some fundamental things that other regions have yet to achieve, and that they've scaled up to a very high level where they will hit deep political divisions and problems in going to the next level.
Thank you, Professor Alden. Let's pass to the following question. Raúl Salgado, a lecturer at Flaxo, he would like to ask you on the debates on FPA and the contributions to the discipline from the South. We are at the stage to discuss about global politics, foreign policy analysis. If not, why not?
I'm not sure I understood the question. Say it, if you rephrase it or phrase it again.
Yes, I guess Raúl is asking about if we could merge this idea of the systemic level with the unit level of foreign policy analysis in order to talk about a global politics foreign policy analysis. We would say a global foreign policy analysis. We would say not only focus on the units, but focus more on the systemic level in this bridge that you have mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, that does exist. Neoclassical realism is an effort to try to integrate aspects of foreign policy analysis into a systemic reading of how international politics went. I was going to talk a little bit about that, but I thought, too much talking about too many things in one small lecture. But just to elaborate for the purposes of this question. What at the end of the Cold War, what neoclassical people, Gideon Rose and other scholars said, international relations did a terrible job of explaining the behavior of states in the international system. They misread the Cold War, they misread how it ended, and a number of other things. The result of that was, and the reason was, they didn't take into account some of the issues that FPA focuses on: decision-making dynamics, the role of institutions, leadership, right? The distinctive features of leadership, state-societal relationships, development status and standing. So what neoclassical realists have been doing in the last decade or so have been trying to integrate the role of some insights, some aspects of FPA into their broader theory, systemic theory. Okay, so it has roots. The simplest way to describe what they're doing, they say, look, the international system is an independent variable, and its signaling of threat and things like that is mediated through states and leaders within states or institutions, through perception and the like. And the consequence, and that explains why there's variable foreign policies. Foreign policy in country A reflects a different leader who interprets the signals from the international system differently from the leadership or the institutions in country B. The social state-society dynamics function differently and produce a different kind of governmental structure, so domestic structure. So I think that it's an elaborate theory, but it's an effort to try to do some of that. Does that do? I sense what your colleague or what the questioner was asking is, can we get away from national policies in some way and start to craft out a global perspective? Climate change, right? I mean, transnational issues, transnational security threats of the kind of such as climate change are going to throw us all into the same boat. Are we going to be able to recognize that beyond the kind of conferences, you know, the different things that we do at summits and what have you, but actually implement policies that are difficult? We will see. But foreign policy, a foreign policy which focuses on transnational issues is, I think, a foreign policy analysis, an FPA that focuses on transnational issues, is what I think your colleague who asked the question is looking for. And it's an interesting thing. I'd be interested to see someone put that together. It would be a very dynamic and interesting way to go.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Professor Alden. Just to go deeper on this questions about foreign policy analysis and its current status, we would say, and maybe trying to understand, I don't know, maybe it's another side of the question, how you see the contributions to the discipline from the South. It means the literature produced in the Global South in foreign policy analysis. How do you assess that contribution? Yeah. And do you think that now foreign policy analysis is also becoming more inclusive and more global, we would say?
I would say absolutely it's becoming more inclusive and global, but the contributions are still small relative to the body of work that's out there. The contribution first and foremost of scholars and ed students from the Global South is to question the veracity of the concepts of FPA. First, how generalizable are the terms that we use? Role theory is one. We've already talked a little bit about that. I think that's, but there are others. Bureaucratic politics. What do you do? How valid is something that's rooted in fundamentally is an elaboration of a particular incident at a given time in a particular U.S. administration? What is valid about that? I'm not saying it's invalid at all. I think it's a very smart bit of theory, but it needs to be generalized. It needs to be globalized. It needs to be, and we see that. We see colleagues in India doing that. We see colleagues in South Africa doing that. We see colleagues in Brazil doing that. So there are some, I've seen work where it's beginning to gel up, but it's really a generational. It's not just a regional comment, it's a generational comment. I think that the younger scholars, emerging scholars, are the ones who need to, and I see them doing it actually, take these issues at hand and begin to craft out their response to an FPA, which is really needs to be just like the United Nations needs to be revised now and again, so too the assumptions which guide FPA need to be revised. Again, this is not an advocate for throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as they like to say, but rather a case that we need to recognize that there's change here and that it can't capture every incident. The other thing I would say is that scholarship needs to be read. There need to be avenues. I'm very pleased to say, at least in the UK, that the journals are actively seeking academics from the Global South. That's an important agenda item because they recognize the shortcomings of reproducing again and again and again the same people. So in a way, this is something for all of you to think about, that there are opportunities in journals, not just in the UK. I think, for instance, foreign policy analysis. I know it's a stated position of the editors to get more voices that get outside of Europe, North America. So I think that all of you should take these opportunities to recognize them for what they are, as opportunities, and begin. And then finally, the third thing, I'm sorry to rattle on for so long on this, but I think that a journal produced by institutions, universities, a coalition of universities, perhaps, editorship circulated between yourselves, would be fantastic. And that would be an opportunity. That would be a way to, help set agendas which matter, to rewrite the some of the conceptual understandings, explore new ideas directly in terms of your own experiences in the global south. So I would think that's a priority. I can say the Turkish institutions have launched a few journals recently in English on emerging powers, which have been relatively influential in a short period of time. So I think that's one example of how you can carve out a space for FPA scholarship in the global south.
Thank you very much, Professor. Let's pass to a question from Carolina Pacheco. She is part of the Chinese embassy in Ecuador, and she asks, even we know that China is a power in terms of economy and multilateral affairs, which is going to be its position in the era post-COVID, and how this is going to affect the South? What do you think?
Sorry, even though we know it's a power in multilateralism, and I didn't hear the other part.
That China is powerful in terms of economy and multilateral affairs. So how do you see its position in the post-COVID era?
First, I'm very pleased that we're almost at a point of time about post-COVID era. I would very much like to talk about that post-COVID era. I think that it has, generally speaking, been able, insofar as its economy retains its dynamism, insofar as it's been able to contain the COVID and communicate. A great deal of public diplomacy has been put aside on the part of China to communicate success, even though we know that it wasn't always a success, but which country hasn't had trouble? Let's put it that way. But anyway, I think that it will emerge if its economy is intact. I think it will emerge a stronger power for it. It's odd. These are unexpected. These are what they call black swan events. There was a kind of, I don't think anyone had a sense of how fast things would move and how this might shift global politics in the directions that it does. But the country that's able to adjust to such events quickly is the one that, and recognize the opportunities, is the one that will, occupy or gain more from it in the end.
Thank you, Professor Alden. Just because of time, let's ask the final question. This is from José Emilio Vázquez from Universidad Internacional del Ecuador. He asks, would you explain how can economic constraints can impact on the decision-making process of weak countries? I would like to put the example of last Saturday's elections at the Inter-American Development Bank, at how several Latin American countries supported Trump's candidate. So what do you think about this?
Economic factors are absolutely crucial, I think. I think that it's, and that maybe this is partly to return to that question of what distinguishes the countries of the global South from the global North. We can have middle-income countries or even upper middle-income countries, but whose the edifice of the economic activity is really concentrated in 2 or 3 sectors, 2 or 3 state-led or large private firms can play the dominant role, and it's actually much weaker economically, and government has to be much more responsive to those economic concerns, at least in the short to medium term. So I think that these, whereas a larger diversified economy, even the UK, which is I think 6th at this in the league tables, there's a pretty, financial services play a strong role, but there's a manufacturing still exists as an important, if smaller, component, et cetera, et cetera. So it means that the economic factors are discussed in foreign policy terms in the language of trade-offs. When your country has very few exports, resource-based exports, or an expertise in a particular sector, the idea of trade-offs is naive. You can't ignore. It becomes impossible to ignore the oil sector if that's the dominant income, where you derive your income. You can't suddenly run a policy that's completely contrary to that. And so I think that this is where developing countries are disadvantaged. They may, if we look at aggregate GDP figures, we may think, oh, well, they're within the range. But no, we need to look at the structure of the economy, and that helps us to understand the influence on decision making.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Alden, for answering all our questions and for this fruitful dialogue with our audience. Again, thanks for the conference and for all your insights. Of course, we consider that this discussion has to be deepened in the future. And just to finish this event, I turn over to José Emilio Vázquez, Director of the School of International Relations at Universidad Internacional del Ecuador.
Thank you, Nati. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Christopher Alden for such a great presentation. And I would like to sum up just a few of his ideas today. I would like to say that he has pointed out the importance of agency to understand the participation of countries from the Global South. He has also introduced the concept of balancing, referring to the importance of collective action against the pressures of other powerful countries. I think this was particularly interesting in his presentation. Additionally, he has pointed out that the construction of regional identity has to do with the concept of balancing. This is very interesting to understand. How can we create regional identity with this concept of balancing? And also he has explained several theories regarding collective foreign policy in Latin America, emphasizing on the idea of brokers, which in his words is a kind of a foreign policy strategy of middle powers who engage as mediators and system stabilizers. This is also particularly interesting for me to understand emerging markets like Brazil, like Argentina, Mexico, India, and of course, the example that you put, Professor, Malaysia. Furthermore, Professor Alden has explained the importance of agency, and he defines it as the capacity of weak states to mobilize resources in order to achieve preferential outcomes regarding their own aims, their aims. And he has also said regarding agency that it appears in different ways, several different ways. It strictly depends on the type of relationships that a country has, and that in order to understand this concept, agency, we have to face the concept of generalizability, and we have to try to understand specific and contextual conditions of Global South countries. It's very important to understand this in order to understand the decision-making process in terms of foreign policy within these countries. Well, again, thank you, Professor Alden. Finally, I can't express how grateful I am to have all of you here with us today. It's a great honor to be part of this International Relations School and to co-host this great event along with the Andean Center of International Studies. I would like to also give special thanks to Natalia Encalada, Michelle Levy, and all the members of the Foreign Policy Analysis Group. Thank you, Professor Alden. Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you for all the attention and time you've devoted to hearing me, and then some wonderful questions as well.
Okay, thank you, Professor Alden. And just to some final words for our Spanish-speaking audience, we would say from Michelle Levy, from the International Center for Andean Studies.
Thank you very much. Just a few words to say on behalf of our in the Center for International Studies, how grateful we are for this very interesting conference, and we are very interested to enlarge the cooperation with you and your center at the London School of Economics. So we hope that we will continue this very interesting exchange of ideas in this very new field of knowledge that for us is not so old. We are starting to try to analyze more academically this field. So thank you very much. We hope that you will have a very nice evening in London, and see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Alden. Thank you to our audience, and have an excellent rest of the day. Goodbye.